Welcome back to the Iceberg Mountain. We're really excited to have you here today. The topic of conversation today is something that's super close to my heart, and it's about freedom or autonomy and how we can foster that in an organizational way to improve outcomes for students and for teachers as well.
Empowering individuals within organizations so that they can bring some cool change. I've been waiting for this episode for a while, and it all started with this documentary I watched called My Octopus Teacher. A person named Craig Foster, he goes freediving into kelp forest, and he found an octopus. And somehow he built a close relationship, a bond with this animal. It was amazing to see how they created this bond through empathy and have this emotional connection, but also learned how the octopus was adaptable and use its intelligence to overcome some obstacles. After watching the documentary, I decided to just do more research about giant Pacific octopuses. And what I learned was that they have a central brain which controls mini brains within each arm, which is kind of crazy. But when I learned that, I immediately thought about the concept of organizations and how they are effectively run. And that idea of having a central brain, which is kind of like your shared vision, your mission statement, the beliefs, the culture of the organization. And then you have the mini brains, which are the individuals or different departments within a structure who do the actual action. So these mini brains in each of the 8 arms actually control movement. So they're action oriented. So they're taking what the brain wants or what it believes is ideal for survival, and then the arms or the mini brains tell the arms what to do. So today, John and I, we want to talk about how that's kind of related to not only just any general organization, but within schools as well.
And I think one of the things that I found really fascinating when you were talking about this is the idea that each arm really can act independently. So an example that Dave was talking to me about this afternoon is that if one of the arms comes upon a food source, it will literally act to grab upon the food source and bring it to the body and to the larger brain essentially autonomously without having to essentially ask the brain what to do. Meanwhile, like there's 7 other arms that may be doing something else, finding shelter, or that's where the fascination is for us, is that idea that rather than having one person at the top in an organization, for instance, that micromanages down, that level of decision making is spread out across the organization so that it can be more efficient and move forward as one cohesive unit. And of course, like David just mentioned now, the idea of having like a very clear mission statement of purpose and vision, that's a really important part of that process.
So I really like the Steve Jobs quote. He talks about self-managing. So the greatest people are self-managing. They don't need to be managed. Once they know what to do, they'll go figure out how to do it. What they need is a common vision. And that's what leadership is. Having a vision, being able to articulate that so the people around you can understand it, and getting a consensus on a common vision. So what he's talking about is the self-managing people are the arms with the mini brains. These individuals only feel empowered to take action when there is a shared vision, and that's the brain part. And that's why I really enjoyed Campbell Mackay's visit, Sean's friend who is an administrator in Australia, because he has such an incredible skill in creating that shared vision.
And so Campbell has been a principal for kind of coming on 20 years now, and he has this real strong focus on developing a management team, and larger than that, developing essentially like a school culture based around a shared vision and understanding. One of the big things he likes to do is to provide his staff with different research papers based around what good pedagogy might look like, analysing that in staff meetings and PD, coming up with a shared understanding and vision of what good teaching should look like in that school. And I think that process in itself, giving people some element of freedom in order to come to that understanding themselves, is really important. But more importantly than that, I think just having this really clear understanding of what their school is about. And when I most recently spoke to Campbell, he said one of the biggest issues with that is keeping it simple. And so they try to simplify it down to 3 or 4 things maximum, and then really focus in on what that means for student learning. Another aspect that I found really interesting when talking to Campbell is that within his management team, which is about 5 people, they have someone from that management team in every single planning meeting at school. It's not in order to micromanage people and control them. It's really just to make sure that the teams understand the vision And if they have a question about maybe an activity or some other practice that they want to incorporate, that they have a clear understanding of how that impacts in relation to the school's vision and mission moving forward. And I think that is a really amazing example of exactly what David brought up today, of having this kind of octopus situation where you have, it's not necessarily Campbell in this situation, but this management team that has a very clear vision of what they want to do. They're communicating it out to their different teams and then making sure that everything aligns, but also giving those teams the autonomy to move forward and do what they think is necessary or suitable for the students that sit below them.
Yeah, and I think without that, if there was a lack of understanding, I think the teachers wouldn't feel empowered to take action. They would actually be hesitant. They're not sure which direction to go. But because of that central brain, they are able to do those things. So
another person who I find really influential as an education mind is Dylan William. He talks about the idea that pedagogy trumps curriculum. I might just read part of this quote because I find it really powerful. He says, "A bad curriculum well taught is invariably a better experience for students than a good curriculum badly taught. Pedagogy trumps curriculum, or more precisely, pedagogy is curriculum, because what matters is how things are taught rather than what is taught." From my perspective, and when I think about this analogy, it's more important that we have a shared understanding as a teaching community about what good teaching looks like and what good teaching practice looks like, rather than necessarily the nuts and bolts of what is taught at which time. Like Dylan Williams says, it doesn't, if you're teaching exactly the right thing but you're teaching it poorly, it doesn't matter. As opposed to if you're maybe teaching something that's not quite in the curriculum but you're teaching it really well, that's a different scenario. Obviously, having both of them together is also a very positive thing as well. We also came across an article recently called The Leader's Role in Building Independent Thinkers. It's a business article, but what I really liked about it is really the idea of looking at how do you empower the people that you work with and the people that are in your organization to take on responsibility and to enact the plan that you've developed. I think missing in schools where we're really hyper focused on this is the curriculum we're teaching, as opposed to saying this is how we teach it. One particular section of that article that I really liked was the idea of this concept of prioritizing action over perfection. So embracing experimentation and iteration. I feel like there is an appetite to talk about giving people power to experiment and iterate on what they're doing with their classroom practice. But I don't think on the day-to-day that's really encouraged. I think oftentimes in schools we're far more worried about conformity than we are about collaboration. And when I say collaboration, like true collaboration in terms of like trying new things and experimenting and doing it a different way to see what the outcomes are and whether or not it benefits our students. And again, thinking about what sort of ideas we hope people might take away from this episode is maybe at an administration level particularly, that encouraging people to take those risks and be iterative around their planning, to try new things and to experiment and record and analyze what they're doing, just to see what impact you can have by approaching things in a slightly different way. That's something that I think administrators can do. And I think as a day-to-day teacher, doing that same practice, but really focusing on creating data around what you're doing so that you can report back to at an administration level about the impact that there is, rather than having really anecdotal ideas, but being able to go back and say, this is what I saw XYZ along the way for each of my students.
So you mentioned about leadership and how we are trying to create an organization that helps independent thinkers thrive. A strategy that we found on Instagram Reels is Stoicism. The Daily Stoic, a book by Ryan Holiday, and he basically has taken a lot of the text behind Stoicism and created this book. And in the Instagram Reel, he showed his tattoo. It was called "The Obstacle is the Way." He's basically saying that we can't control what happens, but we do have control of how we respond. In Stoicism, adaptability is a crucial element where you want to take a situation, a difficult situation, an obstacle, and try to make the best of it, try to do well in that situation or grow. And that kind of connects with this whole idea of the octopus of the brain can't always predict the difficulties that will arise. And also like leaders can't can't really map out exactly what's going to happen, what obstacles will appear, and they don't have a list of exactly step by step of how to solve those problems, because especially if you're trying to be innovative and you're trying to bring change, those things have never been done. And so it's very important that we have these mini brains and arms who are adaptable and can navigate through these obstacles and do the best that they can, have that autonomy. And that's all based on that shared vision, that understanding, so that they feel empowered to do so. Because without that, I don't think those arms would work effectively.
So when we first started talking about this, Dave, I think one thing that really appealed to me is the idea that a clear vision and a goal for an organization is probably the most important thing that anyone in leadership can work on. And the idea that by having that, it allows like your middle managers and everyone to be able to pull in the same direction, I think is really important.
Yeah, for me, the biggest takeaway is actually the students. I think everything that I do as an educator, so project-based learning, design thinking, the reason for it has always been about student empowerment. Like, I want to do my best to create these learning experiences where they have the option, or sorry, they have the opportunity to be autonomous, and give them tools like design thinking to think for themselves and not wait for the right answer or have a supervisor tell them exactly what to do. It's more that autonomous part. So that's why I'm so attracted to this idea of the octopus is hopefully some of the work that we do will create autonomous learners.
Yeah. And I think if I was to paraphrase what you kind of just said now too, I think of that as you can look at this from an organization level of, let's say it's your head of school or your board that sets a really lofty vision and goal for the school. And then the arms are your principal level and middle management. But then kind of what you're talking about now is that idea that with, a rigorous curriculum that's maybe based around problem-based learning or that sort of experiential learning, that you can have this same setup in a classroom as well, where maybe as the teacher, you're kind of setting the expectation and the vision forward, and each individual student is able to make their own decisions autonomously about how they learn, what they create in order to show their interpretation of the vision as well.
Yeah, I mean, I feel a big relief because I've been thinking about this episode for a while, and it's been really nice to articulate it onto this episode. Next week, we are going to a conference together in Bangkok. Hopefully, we can get some interviews with some really innovative educators.
And get some new ideas and meet some really inspiring people that are doing amazing things in schools.
Yeah, and hopefully we can share those ideas with you. So until next time, be the iceberg
and climb your mountain.